Hi, and welcome back to Short Story Focus. Tonight I would actually like to focus on the art of the short story. Now, lately I've been doing my Hugo reviews and I'm going to continue to do those, but tonight I'm going to sidetrack a little bit and we're going to discuss the art of the short story and how to write and create a short story. And of course that's just going to be from my limited point of view. I would like to talk about not only short story tonight, but the short story and sword and sorcery. Much like science fiction, sword and sorcery found its beating heart in the short story, or at least the shorter form. Nowadays you see a lot more novels for that, but there is kind of a rising tide of short stories within the world of sword and sorcery. And there are many great magazines that are offering it now. This little digest magazine is Savage Realms Monthly. And Savage Realms Monthly typically has about 3 stories per edition like this. And these are by the sword, by the axe, action, adventure, pulp era style, really gritty sword and sorcery stories. Just what you always wanted and just what you're looking for when you think sword and sorcery. If you think, old school sword and sorcery, here you go. Now in tonight's video, I want to discuss, as I said, short stories a little bit, and I also want to talk about Savage Realms Monthly. And the reason that I want to combine the two of those things into one discussion is that in this September 2023 edition, which I happen to have here, I have a short story published. And that short story is called Wild Revenger. And so I might like to just talk a little bit about how that story came to be, what some of my influences were. We're just going to have a quick discussion about, number one, writing a short story, and maybe number 2, what comes before you write the short story. Then we'll just do a quick overview of the elements of how a short story works, typically, and how that worked for me in getting this story published in Savage Realms Monthly. In the first part of the video, what I'd like to talk to you about is some of the things that influence me before I write a story. So in this case, one of the things that really influenced me was the legend of the Wild Hunt. Now, it's possible that you've heard about the Wild Hunt through things like the Witcher video game. I know it's mentioned in there, and it probably turns up in some other media that I'm not necessarily aware of. I'm sorry to say I can't keep up with everything. There's so much going on right now, but I do try to enjoy as much of it as I can. And the important thing to remember here is that I'm talking about the historical Wild Hunt that was documented by the rising Christian church in heathen Europe, as they referred to it. So this ancient Wild Hunt can be found written about in this amazing book, which is called Phantom Armies of the Night, The Wild Hunt and the Ghostly Processions of the Undead by Claude Lecatou. He's French. So I love that last name. But anyway, I think right now Claude is actually writing his books as part of a dynamic duo with his daughter. So now they're just killing it writing these books together about the ancient customs and occult knowledge and such of ancient Europe. Now this book is so good that I've read it twice, and I don't think I've ever read a scholarly work twice before. I mean, it was just so enjoyable that I had to do it. I had to go through it twice. I'd never found a book like this before. I went looking for other books on the scholarly books on the subject of the Wild Hunt, and I couldn't find anything. And in the short story in Savage Realms, Wild Revenger, the Wild Hunt features, even after the editing process, the Wild Hunt featured pretty well. Now, I took some liberties and I made some changes when you read the story. For the most part, I also tried to represent them as they are. And in this book, Phantom Armies of the Night, I just wanted to make mention of some of these chapter titles. I mean, check this out. In part 1, it's Hosts of the Night, and it's good women who roam the night, phalanxes of demons, troops of the dead, phantom armies. Part 2 is Supernatural Hunters, the diabolical huntsman, the wild huntsman, the cursed hunter. You know what, I was thinking about that. It was like, cursed hunter. Hunting used to be such a part of making a living at one time in Europe that, talking about the cursed hunter now would be like talking about the cursed programmer. Poor bastards. Part 3 is actually called The Wild Hunt, and they have King Hurla, and it looks like it's pronounced Mesne Heliquin. Heliquin is a kind of a precursor to Harlequin, and Heliquin is also part and parcel to Hel, H-E-L, the Nordic goddess. There's a really wonderful painting of the Wild Hunt, and she is out front, and Odin is in the center. And with most of the traditions, over time, Odin became the leader of the Wild Hunt. And this is not an always thing. This is just a part of the overall history of the Wild Hunt, because it is an incredibly flexible piece of folklore that has a lot of additions to it, as well as subtractions. But it didn't start that way. It just evolved that way and changed over time. When you read these stories, it's the legend of King Herle, the Wild Hunt, Masked Men and Bawdy Fellows, Wild Hunt in Scandinavia, the passage of the Wild Hunt. It's very important. If you encountered the Wild Hunt in the middle of the night while walking through the forest, it was usually a harbinger of doom for you. So there's Odin and the Wild Hunt, scholars and the tradition, Indo-European roots of the Wild Hunt. There are several hypotheses offered, as well as concluding thoughts. I mean, this is a scholarly work, but it doesn't exactly read like one. And one of the cool things about Claude Lencoutu's books is that he very in-depth in his scholarly research. Sometimes the same thing will be covered multiple times from multiple angles and from various sources. So that makes it very helpful in trying to find what I, for want of a better term, would just call story fodder, right? You just need that material to charge your mind and come up with story ideas. And if you're a writer and you've got a brain that works like a writer, or you're trying to become someone who has that, which is what I'm hopefully here to encourage you to do, then sometimes you need seeds to be planted. This is just a bag of seeds in that case, which you can just cast upon the fertile ground of your imagination. Wow, how's that? Because I didn't grow up in an age of sword fighting where people hack each other with blades and axes and run each other down with horses. In fact, I've only ridden a horse a few times, and the one time I rode a horse that actually fell and caught himself right before he hit the ground, and instead of crushing me, I managed to squeeze for dear life, and I stayed on him, and it was pretty amazing. And so then I had a really good time. I mean, it's not scary riding a horse once he almost crushes you. Then it's it's all up from there. But anyway, I don't have a lot of experience with those things. I've been a lifelong martial artist, and so I've done a lot of scrapping and different things like that, but I have certainly never did it on horseback and never did it with live blades. And it's kind of cool, now there are people who are actually doing things like that in armor. I think it started up in Russia, but it's kind of caught on worldwide now. And when I was in my 20s, I was wishing that somebody would start a league like that, and I even tried to start a few things like that, but that is expensive and dangerous. So we didn't get to do it. I do envy you guys who get to do that. I'm probably just a little too old for it now, sorry to say. But the next best thing to being there is reading about it. If you want to read about what it was like to use a sword to kill somebody and what killing with the sword did to people, there are a number of really great books on that subject. And along that lines, one of those books is My Secret Weapon, The Secret History of the Sword by J. Christoph Amberger. The Secret History of the Sword, Adventures in Ancient Martial Arts, once again by J. Christoph Amberger. This is a really cool book. If you just look at how this book is set up, it's just a series of chapters and interludes. And it's very, very well done. But if you want a really great influence for writing about sword combat, there are so many just cool passages in here about people getting in sword fights, just getting really devastated. If they didn't get killed, getting injured for life, all kinds of just crazy stuff. There are stories about people who didn't take dueling seriously enough, to their great detriment. And so why would you read a book like that if you were going to write short stories? Well, the reason that you would read a book like that is that you can use those experiences to put yourselves in the head of people who kill with blades. And if you're going to write about sword and sorcery, then you have to become very comfortable with the idea of killing somebody with a blade. And so that is killing at an intimate range. And so it probably would behoove you to have at least read the way people actually do it. Now, you don't have to write about it the way people actually did it, but it's good to know the reality before you create the fantasy. Much like a Bruce Lee movie is not how we really fight in the martial arts. It is akin to it, right? It is related to it. Nobody has ever used Wing Chun like Ip Man. but it sure is fun to watch, isn't it? It's fun to imagine that somebody might be that damn good. So, you may already understand this, but just in case you don't, as someone who wants to write, the legend and the reality and what you put on the page have an intimate linking that you want to stretch and warp so that you entertain the reader. Because first and foremost, you're not writing a history book, you're writing something that should be entertaining someone. Two other influences that I recommend for any writer who wants to write about people who solve their problems with swords, which is what Sword and Sorcery is. Okay, I have a little joke that I will say to others, but also just say it to myself, and that is that if I want to think about when I'm writing a short story that involves sword and sorcery, what is an important thing to keep in mind? Like, you've got a head full of thoughts and maybe even an outline full of stuff. How do you keep it all straight? The most important thing you can remember overall about writing a good old-fashioned sword and sorcery story is that people in sword and sorcery solve their problems to the end with swords, axes, speed of horse, punch of fist, breaking of the neck, breaking of the arm, slugging the shit out of somebody. They do not sit down at council tables, working out problems and having nice discussions and talks before they decide to head off on a journey that will take weeks. If Conan had been sent to take care of the Ring of Power, it would have been wrapped up in an evening. That's some serious shit talking, isn't it? When you're looking at other books that might be a good influence on you as a writer of sword and sorcery, it's important to look at the precursors to that, and one of the big precursors to that, could be the Iliad. This is the Iliad translated by Robert Fagles, and I really recommend it. So while the main character, Achilles of the Iliad, is not necessarily what I would call a sword and sorcery character, there are certainly sword and sorcery elements, right? He's got a magical mother. He himself is a quasi-magical being with almost no weaknesses. So if you look at the rage of Achilles and you look at this beautiful, expressive writing and all of the great ideas in here and the mixture of magical beings, magical people, gods appearing and talking to mortal men, dire combat where people just absolutely destroy each other with spears and hammers and all kinds of interesting stuff like that. It definitely lends itself to understanding that sword and sorcery mindset anyway. And that sword and sorcery mindset, that the world is a savage place and that the world occasionally returns to savagery, is very important. And you need look no farther than the Trojan War to see a time when the world had definitely embraced savagery for savagery's sake. The other work that Homer kept alive for us is the Odyssey. As you probably know, the Odyssey is the continuation from the Iliad in that one of the characters in the Iliad is heading home and has a story of many twists and turns. And so this has a lot of elements that sword and sorcery holds dear too. The Odyssey is full of, once again, people who command magic, and they're somewhat suspicious characters themselves, transforming men into pigs and different things like that. The Odyssey itself is deeply linked to many Greek traditions of the time, and the main character, Odysseus, is a crafty man who is, by all means, also an excellent warrior, but he's also an excellent tactician. He's also a tricky bastard. He has a lot of really good qualities that would all work very well in a sword and sorcery character. So while you wouldn't want to go too deep into this when you're writing a sword and sorcery story, especially a short one, the influence of how Achilles lived his life and the influence of how Odysseus handled all those tribulations that he was up against, he and his men, those can be very inspirational to you as a writer. What we're talking about here is research, but boy, is it fun research. Now, everything that I've offered thus far in this research part of this little talk we're having here about sword and sorcery, I'm just giving you a sketch. And I'm just kind of showing you, as a writer, the way you might want to look or approach the problem or the task of writing a short story that you yourself want to read. And if you're really charged about your short story, then other people will be too. Another thing to look at when you're writing sword and sorcery is that there's the Conan era of sword and sorcery, there's the Karl Edward Wagner era, there is the Fritz Leiber approach, there's the L. Sprague de Camp and Lynn Carter. They took on the Howard estate. So, you've got from Robert E. Howard up through, to the 60s. Character development in Sword and Sorcery can be a bit sketchy and a bit difficult because the fans don't want you to go to like a Wuthering Heights level of character development, but they still want to get to know and love these characters. So you're kind of walking that line there of pulpy development. And you've got to just watch how you do that. You don't want to hand people cardboard characters. It's hard to flesh them out in the way that you're probably going to want to as a writer, especially with the way that all writing nowadays is character driven if it's going to do well. There are compromises when writing short stories this way with Sword and Sorcery. Also, it comes down to the editor. If the editor is into your deep, rich character development, and you have a guy who also splits heads and you can get that all done in 7,500 to 10,000 words, more power to you. I want to read that story. The final recommendation that I'm going to talk about other books, I'm sure, but the final direct recommendation that I wanted to make was, this is the Landmark Aryan, and this is the Campaigns of Alexander. And man, this is an incredible book. All of the Landmark history books are really good. There's one on Xenophon, there's another one on Caesar, and these have wonderful maps, just amazing annotations. They kind of changed the paper on these, and especially the hardback editions will sometimes have double or triple bookmarks in them, and all kinds of cool stuff. And even this paperback version of this is very sturdy and very well made. But of course, what's within is the subject matter is just so well done. There's a representation of a phalanx, and it's just like that page after page in here. Good stuff. I have about 4 of these, and I really recommend them. They are very good books. I am also influenced by the many characters that have come before me, right? The many characters that were invented before I was born. There is, of course, Conan. There's King Kull, Cain. There's Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser. There's the Conan of the comic books. There's the Conan of the movies. There are terrible, horrible things like the Sword and Sorcerer. What was that movie called? The Sword and Sorcerer, I think, was that one movie. There's, of course, Deathstalker and Unbelievable Deathstalker 2. So that's maybe a little more tongue-in-cheek. But the 80s was loaded with sword and sorcery movies that had a lot of nudity and some really bad sword fighting and just terrible stories and all that other stuff. And I don't recommend any of them. I do recommend Arnold Schwarzenegger's first Conan movie, Conan the Barbarian. That movie is legendary. Up until this point, in discussing a sword and sorcery story with you, I have talked about having a male lead in the sword and sorcery story. But you could also have a female lead in your sword and sorcery story. And there's certainly historical precedent for that. This amazing book, which you could also do your research in if you wanted to, and you would also just enjoy reading this book. It is so well done. And this is The Amazons. I love this book. This is a fantastic scholarly work that sheds a lot of very interesting light. Many of the great ancient warriors of the world were female. The people who roamed the open steppes at the time of the surging of the Greek Empire were a warrior clan of people, various warrior clans of people, and warrior groups of people from Greece the whole way over to the far ends of Asia, who all had mounted horse warriors, and many of them were female. When they find the burial mounds and the kurgans that they go digging through, what they find in those is, for a long time, those warriors were laid out and presented as men, but upon closer examination, it is now known that those warriors are the skeletons of women. And many of those bodies were found with their skin still on them. So they were covered in tattoos, and and it was pretty obvious upon closer examination that they were dealing with an amazing warrior race where the women fought in the front lines on horseback. Many of the arms of these female warriors show signs of being broken and reset multiple times. It was their shield arm that they held out in front of them in combat, and I guess the enemy weapons would hit them so hard that they would shatter their bones, but they still lived to heal and come back and fight another day. They did everything and anything that you ever saw a man doing, and they did it just as well, because these people conquered the hell out of each other and everyone around them. So they were no one to mess with. I just made a note to myself here, so I just want to check it so I don't get it wrong. Robert E. Howard, the creator of Conan, wrote about Dark Agnes, and he wrote about characters that became what we now know as Red Sonja. And he also wrote about Belit, the Queen of the Black Coast, which, you know, Conan has a torrid love affair with her, and they have all kinds of amazing adventures together, and she is completely no one to mess with in that story. And then there's C.L. Moore, and I want to make sure I get the pronunciation on this correct. And it is Jarell of Joiry. Making your main character in Sword and Sorcery is up to you. It can be a man, or it can be a woman, or anything else that you decide. Sword and Sorcery has opened up in this respect, and I believe they call that the new edge. So bring your ideas and anything else you want, and as long as you can make a Sword and Sorcery story out of it, and you can make it work within, you know, what are the accepted strictures of a short story that is going to be Sword and Sorcery, just like a detective story, or just like a drama, or a love story, or, you know, any other piece of genre fiction. Conventions are going to be there. Depending how good you are, you can really twist them and change them, right? Some of the best authors come along and take a convention within a genre like that, and they really jazz it up, change it around, and everybody loves it. And of course, there are always people who hate it, but that's the best part, right? You know, you can't please everybody, and if you're not pleasing everybody, you're probably on the right track. Now that we've talked about some of the places where you could find inspiration and get your thoughts together about writing a short story and what some of the good influences are, it's worth mentioning that the number one best influence for a writing short story is to, of course, read everything that Robert E. Howard wrote in the realm of Sword and Sorcery. So that would be to read at least the Conan stories. Now, you could also read King Kull, and you could read any number of his other works. He's written widely in many different things. He has a great body of work, and it's all out there and available. You can get it on Kindle inexpensively, or, you know, you can invest in much nicer volumes if you would like to, depending on, you know, your level of fandom. I think it is also important to keep in mind something can be very good and not be for you. Okay? Now, I know that that's, you know, you have to really think that through for a minute. Something can be just great, and it's just not your thing, and it's not for you. And you're definitely going to encounter that when you start reading writing from the 1920s. And if you look at any new Sword and Sorcery written in the last, you know, 10 years or more, everybody is well aware that times have changed. But if you read some old Robert E. Howard, it can be pretty shocking. So finally, let's talk about my story that was published in Savage Realms, a small digest here of Sword and Sorcery. Savage Realms Monthly comes out approximately monthly. I know they try. Sometimes they don't get them out every single month, but they make up for it. There's just a lot of good content in here. There are two other authors that appear in this edition. There's a story by Brad Uni, and Morgan Kane are also in here with me. So the three of us have our stories here in Savage Realms. What I wanted to talk about a little bit was just my story, how it was put together, how the ideas came to me, and the things I wanted to do. So as I said, when I was creating the character, you know, sometimes you sit down and you just kind of start thinking about the name. You start thinking about what you want the character to do. You know, you need a name that works without being ridiculous. You need a name that is the name of someone or a character who becomes a person who you want to work with. Because hopefully you're going to write more than one story. Serialization lends itself very well to the Sword and Sorcery milieu, how do you say that word? However you say that word, it lends itself really well to it. When I came up with Vonslar, I wanted to think about him as, in creating a character, I wanted to think about him as someone who had a few strikes against him so that things would be difficult for him right from the start. If you make a totally excellent dude your main character or dudette, if you make this person just completely bitching from the start, where do they go from there, right? So even the most accomplished person, you have to look at them from an angle that allows for growth, right? It allows for the story to ascend to that story climax. It's hard to do that. I think that's probably why Superman's a very hard character to write about, depending how you approach him. But, you know, if you approach him from a romance angle, then, you know, he becomes a different guy, right? Superman's good at a lot of things. He's not good at romance. So there's an interesting way to approach Superman, right? Sword and Sorcery is much the same way. You have to watch out for the God complex in your character. So I made Vonslar older. I made him a warrior who had already lived a warrior's life, and he had had enough of fighting, much like myself. I was never in bloody sword-wielding, arrow-flying, hand-to-hand combat battles with spears and death and screaming and mayhem all around me. But anyway, don't want to digress too much here. So I took him as a character living in a world where you could be an ex-warrior and then you could meet somebody and fall in love and give up your warrior ways and maybe hope to settle down and lead a life of peace. I mean, that would be the hope, right? And of course, you know, characters don't always get what they want. So then I had to put him in context. As I've just talked about, that world that I wanted him to live in and the kind of guy that I wanted him to be, he's this beat-up old ex-warrior who's getting a little too old for the battlefield, and he's ready to settle down and finally just love one woman, be with her for the rest of his life. And he finds an extraordinary woman. In this context, von Slar enters the story walking through a forest. And what could be more cliche in a sword and sorcery story than a main character trudging his way through a forest? So I had to make it unique and interesting. So, and without going into too much detail, that gets worked out in the story. I tried to make it as different as possible. And I also tried to make it as experiential as possible, and I tried to give it as much depth as possible. In giving the story as much depth as possible, what I did was I thought about Dean Wesley Smith's great advice on how you want to take a character and pull them down into the story along with your reader. So you're going to dive down into the depth of scene, the depth of character and character observation, and many other interesting things like that Dean teaches to people who work with him. So I tried to do that with this character, and I have to mention that I probably went a little overboard with that for the editorial standards of Savage Realms. Post-editing process, after getting the story accepted, some of that had to be trimmed off because in a sword and sorcery story, as much as you're going to want to add depth and character development and different things like that, you must remember that sword and sorcery readers are looking for action and adventure. So you need to get to that. The quicker you do that in a story nowadays, it's probably the more to your advantage it will be, but you can only do it so fast because you've still got to develop scenes and characters. You can only hand somebody so much cardboard and a character before they're going to reject it. So that's von Slar's context, is that he's in this world. It's ice and snow, and it's a very shitty situation. He's not doing well. And you know almost from the first lines of the story that he is pursuing 3 bastards who killed his wife on their wedding day. That is his problem. Von Slar's problem is that he has a dead wife and a marriage night that he was deprived of by these 3 guys. Through a series of events and adventures, von Slar finds himself pretty banged up. And that's going to be our first attempt to solve the problem. So his problem is these 3 guys. He's going to have his first attempt. And then that attempt in any good story is going to be thwarted. Okay, the hero never solves it in one try. I mean, what a boring story that would be, right? So you're going to have what we call the try-fail cycle. You're going to have multiple attempts to try to solve this problem. And of course, in the first attempt, it's going to bottom out and it's not going to work in some way. It's going to move the story forward, okay? You don't want to have action that does not progress, you know, the monolith of the story, so to speak. And you don't want to bore people either. Your action, if it makes the story take a step forward, that's that good first try fail. But it's very important to keep those things in mind. With the first effort to solve the problem failing, you will then have repeated failures. Now, as Algis Budrys says in his great book, Writing to the Point, where he lays out this 7 or 8 step outline. What you want to do is have maybe 2, maybe 3 at the most try-fails for a short story. You can have as many try-fails as you want. It's just that as you expand try-fails and you bring in more characters and you bring in more situations, you're just leaving short story realm. That's fine. But if you're trying to write a short story, then you are locked into the discipline of the short story. And with a short story, you're going to have restrictions and strictures and expectations. You're going to have the confinement of genre. And all of those limitations are a beautiful thing when you're writing. To have limitations, to have to keep things within a certain area while you're writing, it's not a bad thing. It's a beautiful thing. Because now you've got to just get everything to work within that space. And it's a real test to your writer's toolkit and your particular abilities as a writer and someone expressing themselves. So it's a great thing. Von Slar goes through several repeated failures, and he keeps trying, and the story keeps progressing. Things get worse and worse for him, but they don't go so well for the bad guys either. But they're still outsmarting him. They're still beating him up. They're still on the run. Different things are happening, and other things are being revealed. And within all of that, I wove in the Wild Hunt. That gave me my supernatural element. A sword and sorcery story is really only going to be a good sword and sorcery story if you have the element of the supernatural. You know, monsters, creatures, demons, sorcerers themselves, magicians. And sorcerers and magicians in sword and sorcery are definitely suspicious creatures who don't necessarily have a defined magic. Now remember, this is not high fantasy like Lord of the Rings, where they have these defined magic systems. With sword and sorcery, it can just be chaos. The magic can not make sense from the start, or it can make sense and then it can veer off into just total chaos. Your sorcerer is going to be a bad guy, he's going to be a total asshole, and we're all going to be out to kill him in that story anyway. The people who are up against them are often afraid of them. These sorceress characters are often feared. Very often the only way to handle them is to split their heads with a sword, right? This is sword and sorcery. We're not going to negotiate. We're not going to talk. We're not going to try to understand their motivations. We're just going to deal with them. That's the beauty of a sword and sorcery story, and that's why it's so much fun. Now, after all of these repeated failures and encounters with magical situations and crazy stuff going on, I wrote a whole bunch of different things, and I even got down into maybe some deeper character development that had to be edited away, you know, understandably. You will have a final failure where the character tries and he fails, and when he fails that time, which is about the 6th step in the story for a short story, and remember, we're sticking with the form. After that failure, then that's it, okay? The character is going to regroup. He might need a small speech from a friend, or he might just marshal his own abilities. Perhaps a mentor will speak to him, or perhaps he'll find it within himself or within herself, and they're going to do what you could just list as victory or death. They're going to go for it. This is it. There is not going to be any other chances for anyone. They're going for the bad guys, and it's win, lose, no draw. Okay, only one person is walking away from this. In this story, Von Slar goes in to face his victory or death, and then after all of that is done, there is kind of an afterword from that, like a denouement, I suppose, and it's also known as the validation. So you want to have the validation in the story, and that could be just anybody else in the story, a villager standing around or another character looking at the hero and observing them and saying, oh, you know, they did that, they are amazing. And once you have your final validation, your story is done. And so hopefully you've stayed within your 7,500 word limit, or your 8,000 or 10,000 word limit. If you're going much beyond that, you're exiting short story territory anyway. Officially, a short story is 7,500 words. Most places are asking for 7,500 to 10,000 for a short story, and most likely if they're asking you for 10,000 but they want a short story, that's so they have some wiggle room to edit. Having to edit a story under pressure from an editor is once again another great growing experience and a beautiful thing. That pressure makes you better. You'll crank out your best work under those kind of conditions. And with all of that said, I'd like to thank you for stopping by. Please like and subscribe. Have a great day.